Sure. My name is Pablo Bose. I am an associate professor in the Department of Geography at UVM, and I also direct the Global and Regional Studies program. My book is called Refugees in New Destinations and Small Cities, Resettlement in Vermont. I came to Vermont from Toronto. I'd lived I was born in India, was raised in Canada, and I had done a lot of work on immigrants and large cities. And then I moved here to Vermont. And, Vermont was new to me. I had actually never heard of Vermont until I moved here. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I've always done kind of community-based work. Where was I going to find immigrants and, other people, and where was I going to find large cities? And what I came to understand here was that there was something really interesting and different that was going on, not only in Vermont, but in other places like this, in small cities, in rural areas, that there had been over the last 20, 30 years, immigration to these kinds of places. I found that this wasn't just a story taking place here. And so I started doing a lot of different smaller studies. I then got funded by the National Science Foundation to do a longer, more detailed study of refugee resettlement in the US. And I started doing that study in 2013. And it wrapped up in 2018, at least that first part of that study. As you can imagine, a lot changed between 2013 and 2018, and especially the kind of politics of it became really big. And Vermont became a really interesting place to explore that. So I lay the foundation in this book by looking at the national scale and the international scale, what's been going on in the world, how refugee forced migration doubled between 2010 and 2020. So we've had double the number of people who've been forced from their homes. At the same time, the world has become increasingly closed to refugees, certainly now in the face of COVID-19, but even before this. And so when I actually look at the three places in Vermont that I focus on, I look at Burlington, I look at Winooski, and I look at Rutland. I look at Burlington as an example of the ways in which immigrant enclaves developed. If you look, for example, at the Old North End in Burlington, I look at Winooski in terms of an ethnic enclave that's kind of outside of the downtown core of the metropolitan area, which is really in Burlington. And then I look at Rutland, and I look at Rutland in the context of kind of Rust Belt cities. Refugees are told by the federal government and its the organizations it works with where they are originally going to be settled. They have much less control over where they're going to go. So why were refugees being placed, as I found in my research, in these newer locations, not in New York or Chicago or San Francisco, but instead in Dayton, in Burlington, in Utica, in Turlock, California, places like that? So first of all, I wanted to know why. Why are people being placed in those areas? Secondly, I wanted to know what happens to them when they get there. What are their lives like? What are their economic prospects? How do they transition between generations? And lastly, what do these places that have received refugees look like? We've heard things in the national dialogue, a lot of fear of refugees. They're going to bring crime, disease, these kinds of things. So I wanted to look at the landscape. What does it actually look like? And of course, what we see is a very different story, that in fact, when refugees, like other immigrants, come into most communities, crime rates are, if anything, lower. Economic prosperity is made stronger. Not to pretend that there aren't problems. There's all sorts of issues for receiving communities and new immigrants. But on balance, the story is a really hopeful one and a really good one. People imagine the things that they fear about refugees and immigrants, that they're going to bring the unknown. But, overwhelmingly, when I went to the communities where people actually welcome refugees, they absolutely saw this as a boon. They saw this as, including some who had not been in favor of resettlement. And once people came and that fear was demystified for them, it became a very different story for them, and a much more hopeful one.